Greetings, gamers. Tim here again, and I know it's been a while. It usually is. It seems to be things get in the way. I've got most of my games put up and shelved finally. There's still a few that need to be adjusted. But today I wanted to talk about games that changed significantly from edition to edition. And sometimes they revert back to older editions because people realize the new edition was not what they desired. Either in a design manner or because fundamentally it was not popular. And I'm going to start with one that is basically a cult classic, and that's Gamma World. Gamma World was produced by TSR. The first edition was fairly heavily derived from AD&D, but it was different enough that, it had its own rule book. Second edition, I don't know how it changed from 1E, but I know second edition better than 1. I just know 1 from listening to people online because I've never owned a copy. Third edition used a chart system similar to the one used by Phase Rip, aka Marvel Superheroes. Unfortunately, I don't know if people didn't like it or if it didn't do well. Even though the system is functionally really robust, it didn't seem to have a lot of fans for that specific edition. I liked it, but a lot of people did. And that's when we get 4th edition, which looks very much like a prototype for what would eventually become AD&D or D&D D20. There's a lot of elements there. For example, they got rid of Thaco from 2nd edition and just had Thok, which was 2-hit armor class, which is basically a version of basic attack bonus. And that was very functional and it worked very well. And there's a lot of symmetry there. Now, unfortunately, it still had a lot of problems that D&D did away with eventually. And that was a lot of different subsystems that worked entirely different from the core. Then we got a version for Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, which I've heard great things about the Game Master's Guide, but not so much about the Player's Handbook. For Gamma World. That's not saying it's bad. I don't know. Those are books I also never owned, like 1st edition. I have been able to read them from other people, but I haven't been able to read them in the depth, like being able to reference them for a video or anything else. There was also a Polyhedron article that adapted 3rd edition to a sort of Gamma World-esque setting called Omega World, which I absolutely loved. I thought that was brilliant. It was really well done. Then we got another new edition with 4th edition D&D, which we all know how 4th edition D&D did. But, what was surprising is I had the Gamma World version of it just because I want to look at it. If it had not had collectible cards, which they were collectible, because you had to buy packs, and it was a big mess. If it hadn't had those, it would probably have been a really functional edition. To me, it was better designed than the rest of 4th edition. It separated out some things that needed to be their own thing, and it did it well. And functionally for me, it made a lot of sense. The rulebook was small, compact, and fundamentally covered a lot of things. Excuse me. But that's an example of one that has pretty much changed almost every edition. We have not received a new edition of Gamma World since the 4th edition D&D one, which I have to make clear because there was a 4th edition Gamma World and then there's a Gamma World for 4th edition D&D, and those are two different games. And it's amazing because I have seen that happen with games. I've also seen it happen where somebody buys the rights to the name of a game and then produces an entirely different game with it that doesn't have any of the setting, any of the details, and sometimes it doesn't have some of the subsystems either. An example of that is the Alternity system. The Alternity system was a late era Wizards of the Coast / former TSR science fiction game that was, for some reason, roll low. I don't know. I mean, using a D20, it's somewhat inspired by the Dungeons & Dragons system, but I don't know why they made it real low instead of just doing real high. It may have been because the skill system worked better that way. I don't know. I read it. I played it. I enjoyed it. It might have been a little better if it was a classless system. But in the game, all really classes did was lower skill cost. That was it. It didn't change your health. It didn't change your attributes. It didn't change what you could functionally do in the game. Just your skills. Great little game system. Not perfect, but great. And it had some really good, like the Star Drive campaign setting was absolutely amazing. But then, somebody bought the rights. And while the system is similar and somewhat simplified, they don't have any of the setting rights. They don't have any of the IP other than just the name. And that seems to me to be a little bit pointless because I liked a lot of the IP. And if you want to sell me to the alternative game, you needed that. It's not alternative without all the IP stuff in there. And I can understand if you couldn't afford it, but if you couldn't afford it, why don't you just write your own game? I mean, why use the name? Did it really going to sell you that many more copies? I don't know. It may have. This also brings up a recent Kickstarter that I received, and I've got to show you this. I've been a huge fan of a game, I grunted a little there, called Talislanta for several years. I encountered the second edition at the bookstore when I was very young, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. It was obviously fairly derived from D&D at the time, but it wasn't D&D. It did have classes, it did have levels, but its primary thing was stat plus skill plus D20 roll. And you had to get certain numbers. Like a 5 was a partial success, a 10 was a full success, a 20 was a critical success after you compared it to an opposed roll. So if you rolled 15 and they rolled 15, that's literally a 0 on that system. So you didn't succeed. Now, assuming with all your modifiers. If your modifiers brought you up to 20 after the minus 15, then you succeeded. But it has changed quite a bit over the years. Gone were classes and levels. Well, not entirely. Gone were levels. They kept classes fundamentally, but they're really more archetypes for each race. But they don't have rules for creating things outside the archetypes, at least up until the 5th edition of Talislanta. Then they changed the magic system through the course of it. Originally, it was a list of spells that you got for having the skill. Then in 4th edition, which is generally called the Big Blue Book, which you can probably barely see behind the little character from Pokemon that I've got on the shelves because it's a lion. That's my friends bought it for me. And I don't remember its name. Arcanine, maybe? Don't ask me. I am not a big Pokemon person. It happens. But it had the best magic system because it lets you do freeform. Technically speaking, it said, oh yeah, you know a lot of spells that you have known from being trained in magic, but when you actually go to the mechanics of casting spells, it does seem like you're making them up right then. Which for some people, apparently, is a logical step they cannot unaccept, that it really is just assuming you already knew these spells, and you're just now writing them up because you didn't want to waste time previously. And usually if somebody wanted to play a caster, I'd usually work with them to make a few spells in advance so they didn't have to spend as much work during play. Then we got the 5th edition actually had a character generation system, but it wasn't well done. It was really badly edited, really badly copy and pasted, and it just kind of failed. It was also not put out by the original people. It was put out by people who bought the license to temporarily do it. It had good things, like the ability to make your own character without sticking to an archetype. But then we get to the next edition, which is literally, they said, the epic edition, and the final edition that the original creator is going to be in on, at least primarily. And that is this box of books. Now, I haven't opened them, and I haven't opened them for a reason, because I have the PDFs. And I have issues with this. It stepped back from the magic system, which was, to me, was a really brilliant thing in the 4th edition, but they stepped back from that, which to me limits the game a bit. There's some editing issues. I know a lot of the people worked really hard to try and reduce those, and they're almost always going to be editing issues. But it's the degree. There's significantly more here than some other products I've seen. But notably is the erroneous art. I'm like, you finally are getting color art, because all the previous editions were black and white. You're finally getting color art, and you don't make sure that the art matches the description of the racial type of the creature. There are several pieces in this book that have the wrong skin color of the races. And we're talking very different. There's one that's supposed to have yellow-gray skin. So he looks green in the book. That's not yellow-gray. Not at all. There's one that's supposed to have a faint muzzle that looks like a cross between a panther and a wolf. One piece of the art does not have that muzzle. The other piece does, which is really inconsistent. Then there's a creature in here that every edition has had art of, called the Exomorph. And in this edition, they didn't use the right art. They used an entirely different creature. Because the creature in question has little fin-like ears and looks really cat-like. Well, the one they're doing has a mane of hair down its back, which is not the Exomorph. It has more traditional ears, which is not the Exomorph. And that's really disappointing. I mean, I paid pretty good money for this as a Kickstarter. You know, I'm a poor person, so it took me payments. I had to pay it out, unfortunately. Which they did. One of the things I feel is great they did with GameFound. But that's the thing. Every edition has been changed, at least slightly. I don't know about first to second, because I only own second. Again, that happens with several games. But it feels somewhat appropriate that at least they changed the system for the better, for the most part. But then they went and took a step back. And that seems to me to be problematic. I mean, I still think the Big Blue Book was the best book they produced. For the price, it has everything. This has most of it. I mean, I'm pretty sure it has most of it and some, because there's multiple books. And I've looked through all of them except the one that converts it to the D&D system if you really are desperate to run Talislanta in D&D. But no, not me. I'm done. I'm done with D&D. That's not to say I will never play D&D again. Just right now, I'm going to be as far from it as possible with other games. Now, this is not the only one that has changed over the years. Another example is Mutants and Masterminds. Mutants and Masterminds First Edition was a fairly simple but robust iteration of the D20 system. Very simple, very easy to use. Second Edition, they complicated it. They made it a lot more complicated, because where in First Edition I can say your character is this power level, which is not class level because you don't have classes, but it's how effective and how many points you have to spend on your character. Now I have to worry about the exact points in a power in Second Edition. And then in Third Edition they separated out attributes from having any dice rolling effect in the game for the attack values. Now, I don't know about other abilities, but they literally made it where you have an attack value and a defense value type situation that are not tied to the physical stats that have always been used for it in previous Mutants and Masterminds. I can understand it because you can say that this person is more skilled or this person is more whatever than their stats indicate. But there were ways to do that even with the stats. And they don't now. But that just adds another level of complexity. So it's gone from fairly decent, simple for a D20 system to slightly more complex to even more complex. And I look at it. I look at Second and Third Edition and I think, I have played the Hero system, which is another superhero system. It is fairly complex for character creation. But it does a lot of what Mutants and Masterminds Second and Third Edition did. So why would I play Mutants and Masterminds when I have Hero? I'm not sure. I mean, it's now doing many of the same things Hero did. Now, for some people, they see it as simpler. I don't necessarily see it as simpler. I see it as about the same complexity, just in different places. Now, there's nothing wrong with liking a game that's complex, so do not get me wrong. I have decided in my life that I have enough problems with life that I don't need to add complexity to my gaming. I don't need something that requires me to spend a lot of time to be able to run it. I want to be able to sit down with a game book and run it that day and know everything I need to know about it. Or if I really have to read it because I can't get it all read in one day because of life, but I want it to be simple. It's funny, though, because if you think about it, the creator of Mutants and Mastermind, Steve Kinson, also wrote the Icons role-playing game, which is much, much simpler. And I've noticed, and this may just be me, but as Mutant Masterminds has evolved, it's slowly begun to look more like the DC Heroes role-playing game. I don't know if that's just me, or if it's just because the similarities of being a superhero game with some complexity. And Icons looks a lot like the Marvel role-playing game, the favorite game, but without the chart, which changes a lot of things. It uses a different dice system that's more averaging than all Marvel did. Marvel was pretty randomly wild, but you had karma to make up for it, and you had generally a good amount of karma. But do you know any games that have changed a lot from edition to edition? I know some that, again, like I said, the name is the same, but the rules aren't. I know, for example, there's a game that I was never really connected to, and that was Tribate. I mean, I liked the system in Heavy Gear. It was using the same system as Heavy Gear, but it was not a mecha game like Heavy Gear. It was a post-apocalyptic, supernatural-ish game, but a very high-concept supernatural game. It wasn't your traditional, supernatural monsters. It was a very weird thing. It was well-written. Do not mistake me. It was well-written. I just wasn't sold on it, partly because of the art. Because something that is supposed to be that weird probably needs art. And it didn't have much, unfortunately, not for me. But now they're going to be making an entirely new edition because it's owned by a new company, and they're going to be using the Blades in the Dark system for it, which may be better than the Heavy Gear system that they originally used, but it strikes me as a very odd change. Not necessarily a bad change, just odd. And I know that there are things that Blades in the Dark does with organizations and stuff that is very well received and fairly popular. I've only played one of the Blades in the Dark games, Scum and Villainy, and it didn't really sell me on it. That doesn't mean it's bad. Not every game is for me. That happens. But there are other games like that. So share them with me. What games do you know that from edition to edition changed so much that it wasn't the same system or it wasn't really close to the previous edition? I know, for example, that Call of Cthulhu has been pretty much the same through 6 editions, and then the 7th edition added something new, which changed some elements. It was a kind of a new mechanic with luck or something. I don't own it. I don't currently own a copy of Call of Cthulhu, and that's my bad, but because I've owned it before. I've owned copies of it since 3rd edition. And that's, that just goes to show. But they've mostly been consistent with minor changes that did not really change how the game is played at all. And to me, I like that consistency. It makes it comfortable. It means if I go from edition A to edition B, most of that knowledge is going to be carried over. I will understand the new iteration of that game for the most part. Although, at the same time, I do have to take one caveat of that, is sometimes a game changes so subtly that people continue using the old version of the rules in their head when they sit down to play the new edition. Even though some of the things they're doing in their head no longer are in the rules. Not in that exact way. That's one reason why I hear people who say, oh, I play a game that's a hybrid of 1st edition and 2nd edition D&D. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably why, because you still carry over all those memories of 1st edition, and liked how it did things, and you just habitually use it with second edition. There's nothing wrong with that. Do not let me say that. But the caveat there is sometimes people don't realize that they're basically hybridizing editions. And so when I sit down and read a book and somebody says, oh, it does this, and I'm like, no, it actually doesn't. I get confused. They get confused. Because then we have to look up the rule. We have to look up how it's supposed to be done. Am I always right? No, of course not. But it is interesting when people do that. And you're like, okay, so which version do we want to use? Do we want to use the old rule? Or do we want to use one? I know, for example, here's one which goes to Icons, which Steve Kinson wrote. He was also the creator of Mutants and Masterminds, as I said. Well, original Icons, that is the very first edition, had players roll a 1d6 minus a 1d6. So they had the start d6 and then a subtractor die from it. And that gave you your modifier for your stats for how well you did. A lot of people have trouble with the d6 minus d6 in their heads. Mathematically, it's not that hard. But, believe me, I have friends who I play games with who would probably be slowed down by that. Not because it's hard, but because it's math. And for some reason, their brains do not connect well to math. To me, I get it. I may have a math learning disability because I love science. I absolutely love science, but I've never done well in math. But when I was taking physics in school, I was doing really well in physics except for the straight up math stuff. Meaning, if you gave me a lab and wanted me to physically do this stuff and then do the calculations, I could do it. But if you took all that out of the lab, if you basically got rid of the concrete elements I could connect with, I'm like, even though I know how the math is supposed to work, my brain's like, no, I can't do this. Because it's just math. There's no real, like, we're doing something, we're measuring something, and I had trouble with that. It was funny, because this was a high school class, but my teacher says, I do not understand it. I give you harder laboratories than I give everybody else, but you still fail the test. I don't understand it. And I said, I understand the labs. I understand when we have something tactily to make it real for me. But when you're just giving me a piece of paper with numbers on it, my brain takes a vacation. Of course, I've learned a lot of math since then. I can now do the math a lot better than then. And I don't know that I have a learning disability. I just know that it's hard for me when I look at complicated problems to get my brain to engage. So I get it. But then the new icons, I've gone off on a tangent. The new icons, instead of rolling a d6 minus a d6, turned it to you roll a d6, the GM rolls a d6. Mathematically, that's the same as a d6 minus d6. But for most people, it was easier, faster. I'm fine with it either way, but I actually like that version a little bit better because I like having some control over the dice in some games. A lot of my games that I have written do not require me to roll. But there are some games that I didn't write that do that, and I'm like, maybe I want to roll a die. I don't know why. I can't explain it. It might be because I've dealt with cheaters before, and if I have control over a die, then I know at least one side of that equation. And I know that, like, if they tell me they succeeded and I'm looking at these numbers and know they didn't, then I know that they're fibbing a little bit. And I don't like playing with people who cheat. And I don't generally play with many people who cheat. But occasionally, once in a while, it's come up. Anyway, so here's a whole lot of me rambling. Tell me, do you have a game that's changed editions so much that you almost don't recognize it? Do you have a game that stayed the same so much that you literally, like, can automatically sit down and play that with no real trouble with the rules? Other than that, peace, good gaming. I'm out.